Hey, welcome back to Pagitt Radio, broadcasting live out of the Twin Cities. Going to talk with Bishop John Shelby Spong. He has written a new book called The Fourth Gospel. Jesus... No. John Shelby Spong unpacks...
Here,
what is the name of the book? For the love, give me that thing. I can't even remember. The Fourth Gospel, Tales of a Jewish Mystic, here on Pagitt Radio.
I'm going to put it right here.
We're going to give a call to Bishop Spong and have a little chat with him about this provocative book. It's a blockbuster. It's a taboo breaker.
It's an imprint. It's a Harper One.
Hello, Bishop Spong.
Yes.
Doug Pagitt from Pagitt Radio and Victoria Lynn with you.
Hi, Bishop
Good.
Spong. Thanks for coming on.
Hey,
Pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show, and thanks for this great book. And you are your 21st or your 24th book that you have published in your illustrious career. Congratulations!
I think that's probably correct, though I stopped counting them.
You did at some point.
But your next one is going to be 25. You should have a big celebration. That's a quarter.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
And you have chosen to delve into the Gospel of John in this book, and so someone who has had a career as a pastor and as a bishop and as a person of faith yourself and as a theologian and a philosopher, what was it that at this point, book 24 leads you to write the Fourth Gospel, Tales of a Jewish Mystic?
Well, I never really liked the Fourth Gospel earlier in my career. It seemed to me to remove the humanity from Jesus. It made him a visitor from outer space. It seemed to me, the way I was reading it, it gave him the ability to know what people were thinking while he was talking to them. It enabled him to claim a divine status in all sorts of conversations. And the book also seemed to me to encourage anti-Semitic feelings. It's quoted quite frequently in Christian history to justify anti-Semitism. It's the only book in which Jesus refers to the Jews as the children of the devil, which is a pretty hostile title.
Yeah.
And so the book was simply not one that appealed to me particularly. I also was aware that this book had been used throughout Christian history to formulate doctrine and dogma and creed on the basis of which we carried out heresy hunts and inquisitions. Yeah. And it was sort of a part of the Christianity that I had little appeal for me. So I kept putting a book off, and finally a couple of things happened that caused me to look at it in a different way. And
you had to write a 24th book, and you're like, well, I guess we got to dig into the old pile of the Gospel of John for this one.
Well, I discovered a couple of things. I discovered from an English writer named Eileen Goulding that the book was deeply Jewish, and that I needed to look at it through a Jewish lens. And secondly, I discovered when I was doing some work on my book on life after death that this book might well represent a strand of Jewish mysticism instead of 4th century Greek thinking incarnational and Trinitarian doctrines. And so I put those two things together and began to read it through a different lens, and it became a very provocative and wonderful book for me.
Yeah, well, Bishop Spong, I want to hear you say a little bit more about that, because you've influenced me in a lot of ways, and have always tended to push sort of the parameters of how I had thought about things. Now, this notion that the Gospel of John is a deeply Jewish book, that is a very fresh idea in my brain, I got to tell you. I mean, I have heard lots of things about the Gospel of John and its construction and all this, but almost everybody would say, no, look, the Gospel of John was written later. It was written by the Christian community that had deep, Gentile influence, and that's just one of the things we know about it, that after Christianity had moved outside the parameters of Judaism, then you get the Gospel of John, and that's not how you're seeing it now.
No, that's not it. That's not it at all. The fact of the matter is that if you look at the book carefully, you find that even the prologue, the hymn to the Logos, the Word, reflects a passage in the book of Proverbs where word has been substituted for wisdom. And it's an attempt on the part of the post-exilic Jewish community to begin to see God not as high and exalted and above the clouds somewhere, but as immanent and permeating all of life. And so that was the first thing. The second thing is that every time it has Jesus use the phrase "I am," if that's the Jewish name for God in the book of Exodus. the burning bush experience, God reveals the name to be I am, or some variation of the verb to be. And Jesus is constantly made to say in the fourth gospel, I am the bread of life, I am the living water, I am the vine, I am the resurrection, I am the gate, I am the good shepherd.
Yeah, a lot of people preach on the I ams, that Jesus does.
And they really, and the really clue to that is to see Jesus say, when you see the Son of Man lifted up, then you will know I am. There's no he in that, but there's he in the translation. And then when Jesus is walking on the water in that story that's told in the fourth gospel, when he gets to the boat, the disciples are afraid, and he says to them, be not afraid. And then the typical text translates the next line, it is I. But that's not what it says in Greek. It says, be not afraid, I am. He calls the name of God and sort of claims that identity. When he's arrested, it's another one of these. He receives the kiss of Judas, and he walks out to the crowd carrying the staves and the swords and the spears. And he says, whom do you seek? And they say, we seek Jesus of Nazareth. And then the text says, Jesus says, I am he.
I am he, yeah.
That's not what it says. Jesus says, I am. He calls the holy name of God, and the soldiers all fall over as if they've been struck down or smitten by the Spirit or something, or they're falling all over the ground. It makes no sense to read that, that I am he, you found your man, folks, if they then fall all over the ground. But when you recognize that he's making a claim that somehow the name of God is revealed in him, even the soldiers fall back in sort of wonder and dismay at that claim. You also go through this book, and over again, he gives intimate knowledge of things in Jerusalem and things in Judea that no Gentile or Hellenized Greek or Hellenized Jew would bother to know. So it's a deeply Jewish book. Even the Jewish great holidays are chronicled in John and in the correct order, where they're hardly mentioned anywhere else. There are 3 Passovers in John, only 1 Passover in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. The Thanksgiving festival, the Sukkot or the Tabernacles, is mentioned only in John. Hanukkah, the winter festival, is mentioned only in John. It's deeply, deeply Jewish.
So how come people like me? How come people like me?
But if you go back to the commentaries in the first half of the 20th century, almost all of them would say this is a Hellenized version of Judaism, the sort of thing you reflected, and the sort of thing we were taught when we were in seminary.
Yeah. So why were we taught that stuff? How come people got that? I mean,
I think what happened.
So obvious.
The big thing that happened was that we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in Nag Hammadi, and we began to learn a great deal more about the first century Jewish community.
That's like 1948.
And we saw
for
in
people
the Dead
who don't know
Sea Scrolls some insights into Jewish mysticism that we thought did not develop for a couple of hundred years. To the first centuries. Then we began to read the fourth gospel through the eyes of some of these mystical things, and it made a whole lot of sense in a very different way. It certainly opened it up for me. You see, I don't think it's about incarnation. I don't think it's about Jesus being the second person of the Trinity. That's a 4th century Greek idea that developed in the Council of Nicaea, about which nobody knew until Dan Brown wrote his book, The Da Vinci Code. But anyway, instead of seeing Jesus saying the Father and I are one, instead of seeing that as incarnation, I began to see that as mystical oneness. Instead of seeing God as a distant force that comes down into the world in Jesus, I began to see humanity as the bearer of divinity, and that the more deeply you become human, the more the divinity of God can live in you and through you. And that's the way I began to look at the Christ figure. He was not a human being it was not a divine being who had invaded human flesh. He was a human life who developed such an intense understanding of humanity that he opened himself to become the vehicle through which the divine power of God could enter into the life of the community. And then you have that insight. You go back and you can read all of the other Gospels in the light of that, and even those other Gospels began to look differently. It was a very exciting study for me.
Yeah, good for you. Yeah, that's great. Well, so one of the things that I know people from some conservative Christian backgrounds always want to ask is, what is special about Jesus, right? And there's a whole desire in a lot of Christian streams to make Jesus unique to the rest of humanity, so that there's a reason we have meetings and talk about him or call ourselves, Jesus followers, as opposed to something else.
What's special about him is that he is so completely and fully human. He escapes the drive for survival and is free to give himself away, and therefore becomes the life in whom God is recognized.
So, is that something that's possible for like would the project of being a fully human person that we're all endeavoring in, should that be to pursue the same kind of essence of Jesus?
I think so.
Now that's got to freak people out when they hear you say, like, hey, basically what Jesus accomplished, you should be accomplishing. But it sure sounds like good news to me.
Yeah. Well, there's a debate in Christian history as to whether or not Jesus is different from you in kind or in degree.
Yeah.
And the traditional point of view has been that Jesus is different in kind. He was the incarnate Son of God, and you and I are just children of God. Mm-hmm. But there's also been a sort of underlying stream through history, and I can date it back as early as Meister Eckhart in the 14th century, where instead of looking at Jesus as being different in kind, you look at Jesus as being different in degree. Now, it might be a mighty degree. That there's a great deal of difference between
almost
a
like
Mercedes.
A kind, yeah, right.
There's a great deal of difference between a Mercedes and a little car that a child is pulling on a string, but you still recognize both of them as cars. I think there's a great deal of difference in the Christ figure and the normal human being. But I think the reality is that human being, when it is full and complete, will reflect the beauty, the wonder, the mystery, and the divinity of God. And the problem with our lives is that our humanity has not been allowed to grow and to be.
And what's caused that? To your mind, like what's caused? If I mean, it feels like there's this sense of human progress over the last 2,000 years or 5,000 years. That humanity is being released from all kinds of typical pressures and problems and oppressions. What is it that's holding back humanity that Jesus somehow was able to accomplish or tap into, that people like us now have a more difficult time as opposed to a less difficult time?
Well, I think that we understand something about the origins of human life that the biblical writers didn't understand. They adopted, I don't know whether they really did or not, but by the 4th century, the Christian church had adopted the premise that the world was created perfect. There was an original perfection, which we messed up by disobeying God, and we fell into an original sin from which we needed to be rescued. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we told the Jesus story. And it's a strange story. It's a familiar story, but it's a strange one. The way God rescues us is to have Jesus die on the cross, so we can say things like, Jesus died for my sins. That's a really strange idea.
Yeah.
That's a strange idea about God, who needs a human sacrifice and a blood offering before God can forgive. That's not a God I'd be eager to worship. Uh-huh. It's a strange idea about Jesus because it sort of makes him a chronic sufferer, maybe even a masochist. But the strangest thing is that it makes you and me guilt-ridden. And the church has trafficked in guilt for 2,000 years. And if Jesus had to die for my sins, then I am the one who's responsible for the death of Jesus. So I'm a Christ killer. I don't know how that becomes anything except bad news. I don't see how there's any gospel in that. And then if Jesus has to be killed in order for you and me to be forgiven, it seems to me that God becomes the ultimate child abuser. Now, the Father requires the death of the Son before the Father is able to forgive. That's just not very good gospel. Now, what we've discovered in a post-Darwinian world is that there never was an original perfection. So there couldn't possibly be a fall from an original perfection, since there was no original perfection. If we haven't fallen, then there's no such thing as original sin.
Yeah.
If there's no such thing as original sin, we don't need Jesus to be understood as a savior or a redeemer or a rescuer. And maybe we've got the whole Jesus story wrong. And so we go back and we look at the nature of human life. And it seems to me that what we see in our humanity is a survival-driven, self-conscious creature. Everything in nature seems to me to be survival-driven. Every plant, every bug, every insect, every flower, every animal, we're all survival-driven. In human life, we become self-consciously survival-driven, which means we cannot help but be self-centered. That is, we relate to everything and everybody out of our own survival fears and our survival needs. That's why we're xenophobic. That's why we're prejudiced. That's why we push other people down to build ourselves up. That's why we're tribal. That's why we don't like anybody who's different. That's the nature of our humanity. And it seems to me that if you can escape that survival mentality, then there's a whole new dimension of humanity, and that's the thing to which I believe Jesus points, so that he can give his life away. The story of Jesus, if I could reduce it to a single sentence, is that there's nothing anybody can ever do and nothing anybody can ever be that will separate us from the love of God. So if you embrace the love of God, you can transcend your human weaknesses, and you can enter into a consciousness that's beyond self-consciousness, what I call universal consciousness, and see yourself as a part of who God is. And that opens up a whole new way to think about God and Christ and about humanity, and it delivers the Christian church from playing the game of rescuing sinners. I don't think our job is to save sinners. I think our job is to empower people to be so deeply and fully human that they can love outside their boundaries of survival.